This is Deep Down, and I'm your host, Jordan Hunt. I'm a composer, vocalist, multi-instrumentalist, and self-releasing artist. You might also know me as former violinist in the Irrepressibles, as the long-standing musical companion to Grammy-nominated Olivia Chaney, or as a musical and associate director of the Theo Adams Company. I delve deep as we explore the creative process and life through the lens of a musician, unravelling universal ideas and enigmas through some of my songs and lyrics, and through some of the profound moments that have shaped me. Join me deep down as we embark on this journey together, in search of answers to the elusive question, what do you really feel deep down? In this week's episode, I peel back the layers of the onion to plot the journey of how I found my voice. As both a singer and composer, I had to find my voice literally and figuratively, and more importantly, I discussed the trials I overcame to discover what was hiding it from view, and how perhaps it was always there, waiting for me deep down. Welcome, listeners. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Deep Down, where I share some of the backstory and behind-the-scenes thoughts and experiences of my life as a musician. In this episode, I wanted to discuss the double entendre of how I found my voice. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a composer and vocalist, pretty much in that order. I studied classical composition at music college for over 6 years, where I learned all about the great composers, mostly of the 20th century, as this was back in the early 2000s. Of course, we looked further back than that too, but there was definitely a leaning on the contemporary edge. And then, after graduating in 2006, I joined a band, the Irrepressibles, and started my musical education anew, learning about pop music and alternative music and indie music and everything in between. I'm not sure how much of that went in. I'm not voraciously curious by nature, so I have a very haphazard knowledge of the popular canon of music, and definitely know more about Debussy than David Bowie. But I understood and understand how important this parallel universe of music is, not just to the history of music, but to so many people. Since around 2009 or 10, I've been writing my own songs, and although I'd always sung at home as a child, pretty confidently, and could do imitations of some of my favourite singers, back then it was most likely Mariah or Whitney, it took me what I feel is longer than normal to find my voice. It's probably fear with the fact that I didn't know myself, joined with the fact that I was afraid to know myself. It wasn't just that I didn't know what I wanted my voice to sound like. I mean, I had options. It's not like I couldn't sing per se. I think I've always been able to make a nice noise, even when I did sing back then. But which of any of those styles was the most me? Was it the breathy pop backing style that I was singing in the Irrepressibles? Was it the high-pitched Mariah Carey impressions that I used to sing as a child, harmonising with my mum and my sister along to her Christmas album in the 90s? Was it this molten honey folk style I developed singing backing vocals and duos with Olivia Chaney? I'm not sure I could say it's any of those, or maybe it's a combination of all of them. And I realised that the big thing that was holding me back was the fact that even when I did open my mouth, what was I going to say? When I talk about finding my voice, I don't only literally mean in a stylistic and tonal sense of making a noise. I really mean in terms of finding my point of view. I remember what felt like endless years of clutching at straws with some sort of innate technical talent to make a noise or write some music. But I was constantly trying to convince myself that whatever I came up with was the real me. I'd amass a bunch of pieces I'd written or sonic collages I'd made for the early days of the Theo Adams Company, or songs I'd attempted to cover, and there didn't seem to be a through line between them all. I always had the impression that the secret to finding your voice was repetition, finding your niche and doing that over and over again. If I think about some of my contemporaries who I would have considered successful, like my artist friend Matthew Stone, who shot the cover of my EP Long Lost, or my director friend Theo Adams, who I still work with to this day, or the other musical projects I was involved with, The Irrepressibles or Olivia Cheney, or The Hidden Cameras, they each had their own confidently unique signature or USP, unique selling point that would help identify them immediately amongst their peers. And when I stepped back to look at or listen to my own output, I didn't see how any of it was connected, and I'm not sure if any of the things I'd made were worth repeating to become my thing. I remember really clearly in my late 20s having a coffee meeting with a friend of mine who was giving me some consulting advice about how to start an ensemble. So the idea I had was to found a performing ensemble that would perform contemporary classical music with me at the helm, the lead composer, conductor, violinist, I wasn't quite sure. It was all a little confused. Even the working name of the ensemble, Ensemble Company Collective, was so confused. Was it an ensemble? Was it a company? Was it a collective? Who knows? It never actually got off the ground, as my very patient and savvy friend could see through my dilemma and advised me as such. I think I was just stabbing in the dark. I felt like I wanted to make something happen, but I wasn't quite sure what exactly it was that I wanted to make happen. I certainly hadn't even reached the point where I'd figured out what this performing ensemble would program or perform, or which composers to commission, or what the house style of the music would be, or any of that. I think all I was excited about at the time was the best font for the logo. It was clearly doomed to failure, as there was no reason for this ensemble to exist. It actually reminds me of so many political initiatives that bear no connection to the context that they're apparently trying to help. And of course, I was too naive to see that I was missing the point. Friends of mine were doing a similar thing at the time, the Camberwell Composers Collective, Anna Meredith, Matt Rogers, Emily Hall, Chris Mayo, Mark Bowden. They had an amazing sense of community and focus and made things happen. Actual real live concerts in real life venues with real new music. And they all belonged. I think what I was longing for was that sense of belonging. Since leaving educational captivity at music college, I certainly floundered a little bit as a composer with no real community established of my own. Hence probably why I joined the Irrepressibles and was drawn to its tight-knit gang. And similarly why I felt such an immediate connection with the Theo Adams Company family. It's probably why my career has been so multifaceted so far, because I've tried many things, worn many hats and fulfilled many roles that I was semi-capable of in an attempt to try and find the role that was right for me, all the while trying to make composer happen, or even make singer happen. In the words of Regina George, stop trying to make composer happen. It's not going to happen. And it wasn't until perhaps 2010 or 11, in my last year or two of the Irrepressibles, this orchestral art pop band fronted by Jamie McDermott, that I started writing my own songs, buoyed by the confidence and encouragement of my bandmates. And at roughly the same time, I was starting to be intertwined in the music making of Olivia Cheney, who was incredibly overwhelmingly encouraging when it came to my own voice and early songwriting, given I'd had next to no training or support in that area. I should mention, while I'm on the subject of Olivia, that her brilliant third album, Circus of Desire, was released this week, just gone, so please check it out. You can hear my backing vocals and violin all over it, alongside Raki Singh, arranged this time by Nico Mully. It's very special. But I digress. It was a prompt from Olivia, who had seen some potential in me that got me writing. Obviously, she knew I was a composer, and she knew I could sing as I was singing backing vocals in her songs, and she hooked me up with my very first gig. My first gig, which in fact was just the one song, was to perform a Baby D cover at a tribute gig at Cafe Otto in London, where 6 singer-songwriters each performed one of their favourite Baby D tracks, 2 Baby D in the audience, followed by a proper set from the goddess herself in response. It was quite surreal and very magical, and really was a baptism of fire for me. But that was the point where I really had to figure out, what do I sound like? If I'm to sit on this stage and make a noise and play chords at the piano, or whatever other instrument I might choose, what would those chords be? What would the arrangement be? What part of my voice would I be singing? Would it be in a low register or high register? These were all decisions I'd never had to make before, or I may have attempted to make them before, but had never been put on the spot to finally make the final decision. I remember that first gig was absolutely terrifying, but there was a really warm reception, and I think people were quite surprised with what came out of my mouth. To be honest, I think I was quite surprised with what came out of my mouth. The song of Baby D's that I chose to cover was called On the Day I Died. I have to say, before that, I wasn't fully aware of Baby D's back catalogue, and had been given albums and compilation CDs of all of her past work to choose a track from. And theoretically, I had free reign as long as one of the other artists on the bill hadn't already chosen it. I remember telling her manager that I was going to cover On the Day I Died, and I think I remember him saying something along the lines of, I'm pretty sure that's the only song that she doesn't want covered. I'll run it by her and see what she says. I think of all of her songs, this was one of the most precious to her, that she probably didn't want to be ruined by some lesser mortal's interpretation, and for good reason, as her original is so exquisite. Luckily for me, though, she was gracious enough to let me attempt to cover it. For whatever reason, it's probably the title that was the first thing that piqued my interest and resonated with me in the way I was feeling at the time. I'm not quite sure what it is about death that draws me to it. I'm generally quite a happy soul, but as someone in their late 20s, I guess I was still indulging in a delayed late teen angst and melancholia. So for my arrangement, I was so terrified to put my own stamp on her song, which was already perfection in its own way, that I had to turn to two other great compositional heroes of mine to steal from them too, because I didn't yet have what I considered to be my own voice. I think fear was preventing me from saying to the world, if I were to cover a song, here's what it would sound like. So to frame her masterpiece, I turned to a rather niche choice, Alban Berg, the second Viennese school composer from the early 20th century, and more specifically his violin concerto subtitled To the Memory of an Angel. It's very taut, highly wrought, occasionally fraught, expressionistic orchestral masterpiece. Very dark, brooding, and passionate for the most part, but extremely tender and soft at its core, and was probably in the vein of where I was at musically at the time, in a world of pretty hardcore contemporary classical music, but with the expressive chaos of his late romanticism. Without going into it too much in detail, because I intend to do a deep dive on this song once I've released my own version, there's a beautiful quotation in the orchestra of a chorale melody that Bach had harmonized, which I learned about at school. I remembered it specifically amongst the 360 plus Riemenschneider chorales because my teacher pointed out when I was doing my A-levels that the tune is so strange and notoriously difficult to harmonize because the opening melody, C, D, E, F sharp, three rising tones, bears so little resemblance to most tonal melodies. Of course, Bach handled it with total deft genius, I think, because it's such a strange tune with these three consecutive whole tones. Berg had taken this melody and embedded it within the final moments of his violin concerto in the second movement. The angel mentioned in the subtitle was Manon Gropius, who was the daughter of Walter Gropius and Berg's friend and patron Alma Mahler, Gustav Mahler's widow. She sadly died of polio at 18 years old, which was very sad, and this was his tribute to her, this sublime quotation of Bach amidst the emotional flux. I guess my connection to this piece was death, like the title of Baby D's song, On the Day I Died. In Berg's version of this chorale, we hear his unique harmonization of this very strange melody, which is so peculiar, arranged so that the solo violin would play the melody, accompanied by these wonderful chords and harmonies in the orchestra, and then those phrases were answered by a direct quote of Bach's version on clarinets, sounding like a Baroque organ, emerging like a ray of light with this wonderful tonality, came from nowhere, just totally harmonious. It's such a moving moment and left a really profound impression on me, clearly. Hence, I made this connection of my own that I suppose only I would have thought of in my strange educational upbringing, and quoted Bach via Berg in a cover of Baby D in the piano arrangement. I went to such extreme lengths not to have to come up with my own melodic ideas. I feel a little bit like a fraud and a bit of a cop-out that I didn't come up with my own original musical motif to accompany the song, and instead my arrangement was an arrangement of an arrangement of an arrangement, which is pretty meta if you think about it. But I was just so terrified to make my own mark and say anything boldly. Of course, I didn't realise till later that this approach opened up my ears to the kind of harmony that I'm drawn to, and the kind of ways of arranging that I'm drawn to, and the ways of structuring that I'm drawn to. And actually, that arrangement was a really nice, safe space for me to practice planting the seed of my own compositional voice in this new venture of songwriting. Luckily for me, the song was also just within my vocal range, and so even though at that point I had absolutely no vocal training, I was able to pull something off without cracking or breaking or losing vocal control. So looking back, I think that was the point at which I had the first glimpse of what my current voice would sound like. Of course, that was not the first time I'd made a compositional decision. By that point, I'd already been at music college doing composition for 7 years, previously trying on various hats, trying to create musical pastiches of all my favourite composers: Debussy, Britten, Ligeti, Carter, Shostakovich, Lutosławski, etc. Even Vaughan Williams and Tchaikovsky, if I go back far enough. All of these influences have made me the composer I am today and lay the foundation of my musical vocabulary. But the fact that I managed to blend an arrangement of a chorale melody via second-hand Berg arrangement of Bach via Baby D's surrealist postmodern poetry is a testament to the way my brain works. And even though, as I said, I felt fraudulent to claim that I had any credit in this arrangement, eventually I look back and see how it's really all one through line to finding my compositional voice today. If you don't know the original song by Baby D, please go and check it out before listening to my impression of it. But there is actually a recording of me singing it live at my long-lost EP launch at St Pancras Old Church back in 2018 over on my YouTube channel, and I have also since recorded it in the studio to include in an upcoming album of songs. So at some point, as I mentioned, I'll do a proper deep dive of that song and the lyrics and the music. Also, do check out Bach's chorale prelude. It's called Es ist genug. And of course, if you have time, listen to Berg's violin concerto, or at least the excerpt of the Bach chorale that I'm sure you'll find on YouTube somewhere. Prior to that opportunity, my first ever gig, finding my literal voice, I'd had a couple of goes at writing contemporary classical music post-graduation, which was much harder with nobody commissioning it. I even made a dance theatre piece called Muses. I think it had a previous title, Ne me quitte pas, that I performed at the Queen Elizabeth Hall on the South Bank, and also at the Aldeburgh Festival and Manchester Art Gallery. Now I think about it, it really did the rounds. I quoted Ye Sacred Muses, William Byrd's elegy on the death of his colleague and mentor Thomas Tallis. I stumbled across a performance of it late one night on BBC4 when I was avoiding going to sleep, and turned that seed of an idea, that song, into a 40-minute dance theatre melodrama with myself at the centre. So you may see a thread here of the things that inspired me or that I was drawn to, and the way I was quoting other people's work as a kickstart to my own creations. Of course, looking back and now thinking about all the other times I attempted to make something happen, I was probably just trying to convince myself of the task at hand. I see how all those quotations and leaning on the shoulders of giants were all just stepping stones to arrive at this point. Now I finally feel like I have an overwhelming connection and confidence in the flow of thoughts through my head. And I'm compelled to share them with you all without fear in this podcast. But I couldn't conceive of doing this podcast a decade ago or longer, when I was still so unsure of my voice and what I had to say. And I don't really remember the moment when that change occurred. I imagine therapy has a lot to do with it, but also lots of practice and lots of failing and having another go. Back then, if I had made a podcast, I probably would have done an interview series or such, where I was simply the facilitator of other people's ideas. But now the idea of it feels maybe a cop-out. Perhaps one day I should create an interview-style show where I have my friends around, because I certainly know plenty of interesting folk and have fascinating conversations with many interesting minds, I'm lucky to say, and I'd be very happy for their ideas to be front and centre. But in a more literal way, I found my voice through making a noise, and of course it's the only way you can try these things is exercising the muscles. I'm pretty introvert by nature and have been softly spoken for, I'd say, the majority of my life. I was definitely known as a mumbler by some of my family and friends, for example. I'm certainly more outspoken now than I ever have been in my life, and I remember when I was 15, I was probably almost mute as far as my conversation went. It's not that I didn't have anything to say, but I think I was such a highly sensitive person that I assumed everyone could read my mind in the way that I felt I could read theirs, without having to actually say the thing. Oh, to be a teenager. I guess what I was experiencing was my early signs of the power of observation, which of course now I use every day when I'm teaching. The main thing I've learned, though, is how to open my mouth and then communicate these thoughts to my pupils and to anyone else who will listen to me, like you guys. But it's funny when I think back to my time at music college as a composer, where I was given the incredible gift of being taught technique without the pressure of knowing what I was going to say with this technique. It did occur to me when I was learning composition, I'm not quite sure what it is I'm saying, but I'm making a noise. My incredible teacher, David Horn, told me all the tricks of his trade and gave me all the magic up his sleeve, and told me fundamentally how to create music even when I had no inspiration and only a deadline. It really is one of the most useful skills I've learned, to churn something out and make a draft, even if you don't feel inspired. Of course, these days, it's not that I'm lacking in inspiration, but rather lacking in time. I feel that now I've seen so much and lived rather a bit more than I had done back then. I have so many more options about what I like and don't like, and what I love about music and what I'm not so into in music, and the sound and the world and the feelings I want to create. And I'm so confident of the fact that I'm really an emotional processor. I have very little interest in creating music for conceptual sake. When I was at music college, it wasn't very fashionable to write purely emotional music. However, I'm clearly an emotional person, an artist, and so I would have to fool myself into thinking that concept were enough for me, and I think I wrote some pretty interesting music, but actually deep down I think the thing that drove some of my best music, or juvenilia, when I was younger, was the emotion behind all of the technique. Of course, a teacher can't really teach you how to feel. They can only point you in that direction, and David knew that well, but he could see in me that I had access to some kind of emotional font, and that all I needed was some technical training to be able to craft it into some sort of decent shape. I had a couple of other composition teachers over my time who taught me what they know from their own perspective. Of course, we can only ever really teach what we know from our own perspective, and in retrospect, I can give them grace and generosity to think that they probably couldn't cope with an oversensitive, over-arrogant, technically trained little pipsqueak like myself. But like my late Aunt Agnes said to me, that academia was not really the sole point of university. I'm not quite sure anybody expected me to come out the other side fully formed. It was rather, instead, a place to make mistakes in a safe environment. And make mistakes I did. One of the strangest lessons I've learned, though, is that I've been so scared to claim my voice as my own. So I thought that what I had to say was not enough. I wasn't good enough. I wasn't in the right style, I wasn't cool enough, or any other such self-deprecation. These days, I have full confidence in my taste and ideas and abilities, and of course a healthy dose of self-doubt in the right places, and I'm lucky enough to know who to ask when I need an opinion that perhaps I don't know the answer to. Deep down, in order to find my own voice, I realised that I had to look inwards to my own inner world and claim my own opinions and desires, rather than comparatively looking outwards to the work of other artists. Of course, we all have that moment where we may think, oh, I wish I'd thought of that, or I wish I'd written that, when something really resonates with us. But what I love about my current age and where I'm at in my career is that I feel like I know myself so well now. Through this internal interrogation into what makes me me and what are my superpowers and what am I drawn to that distinguishes me from and unites me with other people. And when I mentioned earlier that fear was holding me back, I guess I meant that it was fear of other people seeing the real me and not liking it. But these days, after a lot of therapy and a lot of self-compassion, I love the real me, and so it's none of my business if someone else doesn't like my work. I know it's just not for them. You really have to lean into your personality wholeheartedly and be authentic. I hope I've reached, or I'm beginning to reach, that point in my own music, in the pieces I write. And with every singing lesson I take, hopefully I get a step closer to unfurling the voice that was there all along inside, that perhaps I was too scared to hear when I was younger. And of course, in the eternal wisdom of Oscar Wilde, be yourself, everyone else is already taken. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, follow, and review this podcast. And if you like it, share it with your friends or on social media. You can find me on all social platforms by searching at Jordan Hunt Music, and you can listen to my music on all good streaming services. Deep Down uses bits of my music nabbed from my songs Ocean Floor and Peter. Check out the show notes on jordan-hunt.com for exclusive tidbits from this podcast. I'd really love to hear from you via DM or email via my website if any of these experiences resonated with you, and if you have questions, suggestions, or requests for future episodes. Thank you so much for listening.